Welcome back to another episode of the Bonsai Stuff podcast. Scott Martin from Bonsai Matsu, and it's an absolute pleasure to have you on board. Thank you for tuning in, and this week I want to talk about some carving machinery tips. Done a bit of carving lately, which is an odd time for it, but it's nice. I enjoy getting on the electric tools and the hand tools, making some deadwood look a bit more interesting. And it's one of those things that, I don't know, I just feel that it's a rite of passage. Everyone that gets into bonsai sooner or later ends up with a Dremel or something equivalent, and possibly some more high-powered gear, some more damaging, I suppose, or more intense carving equipment. It just seems to be something that everyone in bonsai sooner or later gets to, and it's a conversation that maybe starts with a little bit of deadwood here, maybe a gin here, a bit of a shari, something like that, and then it's like, oh, maybe we could carve this. And then you're at a nursery, you find a big stump that you like and think, first thing that comes to your head is, I can carve that. And it's nice. It's something that we've all done. We've all been there. I really enjoy it. I like it. I like taking my time. I like doing certain things. And when I was working on it the other day, I was taking mental notes to explain through this podcast how I do things, because I will, at this stage, unless something drastically changes, I will never do a workshop with carving tools, with electric carving tools. I just think they're way too dangerous. And it's one of these things that you need to learn how to use it. You know, I think about carpenters or chippies or tradies. They all get shown over time how to use their tools, and you build up that knowledge base. But when it comes to bonsai and comes to carving, you might see a few things online, and YouTube might have a few videos of how to do things, or seeing people carve, and you think, yeah, bang, I'm into it. And there's a lot of nightmare stories about damage that can be done, not necessarily always to the tree, but to yourself. And I think it's just a timely reminder that there's some things that we need to make sure that we're doing correctly. And I've got a few tips and tricks that might help you control the device, that the way that you use them, and that's the most important part. So I want to talk about that quite a lot in this episode of the podcast. So whether you're into carving, whether you're not, whether it looks manufactured, whether it looks natural, there's a blurred line somewhere in between there. And I think that using, sometimes there's people that, and I'm sure you're listening to this, you may hear this and think, no, you never use a machine to carve bonsai. It's all got to be done by hand. And I think, in my opinion, there's a combination where you can use certain different tools in your collection that will do certain different things. Larger mechanical tools will do the big stuff, and then you'll work your way down to maybe something a bit finer on the electric side of things, and then you'll work towards the hand tools to finish it off, and then a few little techniques in there to maybe smooth it off a little bit. But anyway, let's get in the podcast and talk about some carving tools, and hopefully you find it interesting and something which may save one or two of your fingers down the track as well. Now, you knew when you first heard this podcast was going to be about carving, you knew there'd be something about safety. So I'm going to start with that and get it out of the way. Please be very careful. Be very, very, very careful. These things are designed to rip and tear, and it's indiscriminate as to what it rips and tears. So with your hands, always keep two hands on the tool. That's the best advice I can give you, because there's no safety, there's no ability to automatically turn this thing off when you remove one of your hands, as there is with a lot of other garden tools that we use. But with Dremels and with die grinders, you don't have that safety feature. So it's really, really important that you be as safe as you possibly can. From a mindset point of view, I think that when you're carving, whenever you're with your bonsai, put it that way, whenever you're with your bonsai, but you're doing things that are on the dangerous side, you've got to be present here and now. Don't be distracted. Don't be focused on something else, because I can guarantee you that's when mistakes happen. Don't be tired. I like to do my carving first up in the morning. I like to be fresh, have a nice hot coffee in my belly, and then I get into it. And I find that I work a lot more efficiently. I can plan things out and say, okay, I'm going to do this part first, then I'm going to transition and do that, and then I'm going to do this, and I'm going to do that. And I find that I can neatly work up the pieces of the puzzle to get to the end piece. When you're carving late in the day, well, I'm talking from my experience, but when I'm carving when I'm a bit tired or a bit overexerted, and it is hard work working with machinery, I find that I can get a bit lax with things, and maybe one hand will be holding the tree and one hand will be on the tool, and that's when you've got next to zero control of these things, and when things jump, things go wrong, and you can really pay the price for it. So that's the get out of the way part of the podcast. Just be very, very safe. Be very careful. Keep in mind that a tree. I know as hard as it sounds, a tree is replaceable, but your limbs, may not be. So just be very careful. And I've seen photos. I've heard lots of horror stories. And I've seen some horrible things. So I would hate for anyone that listens to this podcast to suddenly jump into carving because they've heard it here and thought, yeah, that's a great idea. I've been thinking about it for a while. I'm going to go out there and buy myself a Dremel, and then you end up in the emergency department. So the other thing, all right, so with carving, less is more. All right, you've got to be very careful that you don't over exaggerate the carving. You can do carving little bit by little bit, like building blocks. Like when we style a bonsai, we might start with the primary branch wiring first. Then once that's set, a year or 6 months down the track, whatever it is, then you get into the secondaries. You don't have to race to get the carving all complete in one section. I find that evolution of carving, that doing little bits at a time, can really help with building something which is pretty special. Jumping into it, trying to get it all done in one sitting and saying to yourself, all right, I've got 1 hour, get this done because then I'm out of here. I've got a dinner, I've got something else I've got to be at. I think that you're going to put yourself under pressure and it's going to be wrong. So less is more. And when you're working with, I suppose, anything, even this applies to the hand carving tools as well. Small movements. All right, you want complete control of whatever it is that you're working on, because when you remove something, when you carve something, you can't put it back on there. And the last thing that you want is for that to happen and then suddenly destroy the design that you had in your mind. So I find that really small movements with carving tools works really well. The speed of your carving tool, the spinning rate of the head, sometimes you can't control. Like with die grinders, they'll just spin as they're designed to. But other things like your Dremels or your small die grinders, you might be able to get some kind of speed control on them. And I find that when it spins too slowly, you're going to be hitting and cutting and then jumping. So you've got to make sure that bit that you're using to cut is spinning fast enough to remove it. I don't ever run them flat out. Like, on a scale of, 1 to 10, I might be cutting around about the 7 mark as a guide. I'd never cut down around the 3 to 5 mark. It feels easier to control when it's spinning slower, but you'll find that it'll start to dig in and then jump and spin down. So you want to make sure that that's not happening. So don't run it absolutely flat stink. There's no need. But I reckon about that 7 to 8 mark, whatever that equates to on your particular machine, that I find works exceptionally well for me anyway. So you want to make sure it's spinning fast enough, not too fast, not too slow. And I think that one of the best pieces of advice I can give you is to practice. Pick up something. Don't work with dry wood. Dry woods can be really hard to work with. When you get a wet lump of wood, you find that it can sort of carve a little bit easier. The tool goes in a lot smoother. So I'd start with something that's wet and fresh and work your way up to the dry stuff, because the dry stuff can be a little bit harder depending on the type of wood and type of tree that it is, but it can be a lot harder to work with dry wood. So at the start, you'll find that you'll get the feel for things when the fibers are nice and wet in the tree. So if you go and get a limb off a tree in the garden that's going to be removed anyway, put it into something like a vise or a clamp, cut it off so it's, pick a size, doesn't really matter. Say 30 centimeters, a foot, whatever it is. Put it into a vise, maybe, mark something out with texture or chalk or whatever it's going to be, and then use your tool to practice and work out what speed it seems to cut at best. But you'll find that you can learn on a piece like that and not do any damage to one of your bonsais, not any long-term damage, but you'll get the feel for it. And it's like anything. It's like wiring. It's like anything that we do with our bonsai. The more you practice it, the better you're going to be at it. With carving, like I find it's a regular request for me, so I'm always on and off the tools doing carving, and I find that I can stay up with it, and my skill level stays at a certain point. When it's you and you're only maybe doing it once every now and then, it is a bit like riding a bike. Like, it'll come back to you, but it can take time as well. So I'd suggest that maybe you refresh your skills before you start jumping into your tree. You don't want to do, as I said, you don't want to do permanent change to your design just because you're a bit rusty with the tools. And, like I said, pulling them out once a year is very different to pulling them out once every week or every 2 weeks. So that's what I would suggest, is just get a fresh branch, fresh stump, make sure it's something significant, as wide as your vise or your clamp will hold. And, maybe, like I said, 30 centimeters, and just sort of start working your way up. Get the feel for the tool and how it's working. And I find that if you strip the bark off this practice piece of wood, or whatever it is that you're working with that you want to carve, a nice piece of advice that I'll give you that'll make the carving appear more natural and like it's not been forced or man-made is to follow the grain of the fibers. So have a look in there. When you start cutting, you'll find, like when you make shari on a juniper, for instance, let's say, you grab the fiber and you pull the fiber, and the fiber tears along the path that it's grown, whether that's dead straight, whether it twists around because it's been wired into a corkscrew, whatever it is, that fiber will show you the grain of the tree. Now, with your carving, I'd strongly suggest that you follow the grain of the wood as well when you're doing the carving, because otherwise you're going to start cutting across the grain. And this is where your design for the carving has to flex a little bit. I think that always let the bonsai show you what should happen or dictate to you what's going to happen. Don't say, okay, tree, you are going to have dead wood. It is going to go exactly here, and this is how I'm going to carve you. Because if you cut across the grain to make, say, a hollow or, a line up the trunk or something like that, all those fibers all the grains that are sticking out along the edge, when it's first done, will look okay. But over time, those fibers, those grains are going to start to separate, and you're going to find that you've got a cut going one way and the fibers going the opposite way, and it'll look funny. It won't look like it's right. Whereas if you follow those fibers around, then they'll stay together and it'll look like it's more natural on the tree. And this is where using machinery as opposed to hand tools can make things look a little bit artificial. If you're using hand tools, you'd be forced almost to follow that grain, because you'd be grabbing things and tearing, and it'd be going along the grain of the tree. Whereas when you're using a machine, it doesn't care. Wherever you put pressure, it's going to start cutting. So you need to visually inspect the tree and then follow the grain of the wood. Work with the tree rather than working against it. The other thing is to build texture on the tree as you're doing it. So you've got practicing, you've got following the grain of the tree, and then next thing I'm going to talk about in the podcast is to build the texture, which I think is super important. So I don't believe that you just do carving for the sake of it. You're doing it because you want to create interest, and might accentuate movement. You might take a boring part of the trunk where there's nothing and create real interest, so it draws you in. It could be a hollow, it could be nice sort of showing the grain of the tree. It can be working to connect other bits of deadwood, gins on the tree or something like that. But it's you wouldn't do an extensive carve to the back of the tree where you're not going to see it. It defeats the purpose of doing it in the first place. So keeping in mind that the carving has to be a real centerpiece to the design of what it is that you're working with, and that it's got to be, first and foremost, it's got to be good. Like it's got to be user friendly. It's got to create that interest where people look at it and go, that looks amazing, or it makes the tree look so old, or it looks so natural. Like, how did that happen? Like, rather than a straight stump of wood, it's got a hollow in there, or it's got something. But that interest builds from texture, and the texture, I worked the other day with an elm, an English elm, and it was a dead flat stump. Part of the bark had withdrawn and died, branches had died. But when you removed everything, it was, it's pretty much what I'm talking about. It's about 30 or 40 centimeters tall, and it was just a solid mass, straight up and down, left and right, no interest. It's like someone had got a ruler out and measured, sort of 10 centimeters apart on the bark, drawn lines straight down there and said, right, that part of the tree is dead. It was connected to a dead root from being collected and repotted, whatever. But anyway, so it was dead flat. Like, you put your hand against it, it's like a ruler. It's just, like a wall. There's no interest in it whatsoever. So what the plan was to build interest. So there's a hollow that would have been, I'm measuring with my fingers now, but it's about 7 centimeters high and maybe about 5 centimeters wide. So rather than just putting, and the central core of the tree had rotted out as well, but the wood's quite thick. The wood all the way around, it was, nice thick stump, but it's probably about 4 centimeters deep. So you can't just sort of put a hole in there. It's got to tell a story. It's got to look like there was, say, a branch growing out from that spot. The branches come off, and then it's hollowed down the center core, and then so I've got this flat bit of plaster that's dead straight. And I've got to put a hollow in it because I want to create interest and create shadows. Shadows are one of the key parts of carving. That's what draws you in, seeing shadows. But, so I've got this hollow that I'm building, 7 centimeters, 5 centimeters wide. I've got to not just put the hollow through there, like getting a reciprocating saw and cutting a hole. I've got to carve that out, but I've got to make it look like there was a branch there. So when branches grow, they get a branch collar, right? So it starts to come out from the trunk, the collar, and then the branch starts to take off. So in my mind, I was thinking, I've got to create on this flat surface a collar to make it look like there was a branch there. I've got to hollow the center, and I've got to round it. So I've got to then drop the wood, the massive wood, around the outside of this hollow, back down. Let's say, give it a dimension, say a centimeter back in depth-wise. So it looks like that branch has started to grow out from the tree. So you do this by working really, really slowly, high spinning speed, but working really slowly and just working with the texture and slowly working that wood back left and right hand and top and bottom of where this hollow was in the trunk. And that's going to build another layer up. So then I've got this flattened part, I've got a hollow in the middle, but I've got square edges around the cut side itself, around the hollow. So then you've got to smooth that over. So then I start working with a burr bit. So I started with a nibbler. It's a more intense cutter that was on my die grinder. So it spins at a massive, really high speed. So that's what creates the hollow for me. Then once I've done that, then I switch out to burr bits, which work in the Dremel, which are a lot more refined. They do more gentle carving rather than this aggressive cutting work, and that's when I start to work the texture of the wood around it to spoon it out, so it sort of comes out facing towards this hollow. Then I'll use the burr bit to round off the edges of the hollow as well. So it starts to feel and starts to look more natural, and you can use the internet for this sort of thing. Like, jump on Google or whatever, and search images of, let's say it is a hollow, for an example, or whatever it is. Look at how they look, and think about what's in front of you and how can you make what you've got look like that. It's that database that I talk about, having all the different bonsai styles in your head. Carving is no different. If you see something that you like when you're scanning and blowing brain cells on social media, then save it. put into a folder, have a look, and come back to it later on and go, that's really cool. I like that. How that's been made out of the texture of it. Think about the texture. Think about why you like it. Like what's dynamic about that carving, and then you can look to replicate that. I mean, you'll never be able to do it exactly, but it builds into your mind a skill set, or you work on the skills that you've got to try and emulate something. And it could be a photo of a tree in the wild where you look at it and go, that's amazing. I really like the way that looks. And I would love that on my bonsai, where the branch looks like it sort of comes out, a distance, and then it's snapped, and then the core of that branch is sort of hollowed out, and then it's all jagged around the edges. That's definitely possible, and it's something that you can do with almost any tree, as long as the wood's going to last the test of time. But you can do that stuff. It just takes skill and different tools. I find that some of the tools that the three main tools that I'll use in my die grinder, I've got the nibbler, which is a big cutting tool. Then I'll work in the Dremel with my burr bits, which allow me to smooth things off and take away that machine impact. So when you use a nibbler, you're going to cut, and there's going to be lines, for want of a better word, in the cutting that you've done. Most times, especially when you're first starting. Then the burr bit comes in and smooths that out. I also use a little drill bit in the Dremel, and I use that because that can create hollows, like wormholes in the wood, borer holes, where you can follow grains and texture, and you can dig things out a little bit more controlled and a little bit slower, and follow things along. And then once I've got those lines in the deadwood with the drill bit, it's actually a router bit, so it cuts both ways, which is really important. So if you're pushing up, it cuts. If you're pushing down, if you're pushing left, if you're pushing right, it doesn't matter. It cuts the wood. Whereas a drill bit, you might find sort of jumps and only cuts when it's being pushed one way. So that's a bit of a tip for you. But then once I've got those lines in the fibers from the drill or from the router bit, it's a fine router drill bit, not one of the big cutting router bits. Anyway, then I'll use the burr bit to come in and smooth that over. And after that, you've got two choices. You can use a wire brush by itself onto the wood. It's okay, doesn't work brilliantly, but what my preference is to use flame, use fire. You've got to be very careful. I say this with hesitation, because if you don't protect the foliage on your tree when you're using any kind of fire, doesn't matter how big or small it is, you're going to cook that foliage and it's going to die. So you want to make sure you get a wet towel, put it over the foliage, protect it, make sure that it's nowhere near where this flame's going to be. So don't sacrifice your bonsai to make your deadwood look good. So really take extra care making sure that it's protected. But then once you've done all the carving work, if you get out the blowtorch, big, small, whatever it is, get out the blowtorch, burn the wood, and focus on the harsh lines where you've got those mechanical marks from the machinery. Burn it, and I mean really, really char it up. Don't leave it sitting on there for half an hour or anything like that, but you'll find that a couple of minutes working up and down, it may catch on fire from the sap, whatever, just blow it out. But just keep burning that wood, then get the wire brush, and then go over it and smooth it off. And you'll find that what was once pretty distracting with some man-made marks on your tree suddenly smooth out a lot more, and you'll find that it takes on a real natural sort of feel to it as well. And those grains that I talked about before will start to open up with the heat process as well, quite naturally, and it looks tops. It looks really, really good. So you want to make sure that you're building texture and build the texture with the different tools that you've got in your collection. But then when it gets to that end point where you've got that human interaction feel to the carving, you can use other things like fire is my go-to every single time. I always use fire at the end of my carving. Sometimes I'm trying now with some of the carving I do to not need it by being a bit more thorough with the working that I'm doing. But if you do feel that you look at carving and think, yeah, I can see where the machines hit that, I'll tell you, maybe just go over it a bit more with the burr bit, burn it, wire brush it, go over it with the burr bit a little bit more, because the burr bit smooths everything off. As long as you're not putting too much pressure on it, as long as you're just gently skimming across the surface of it, you'll find that it'll just start to take the rough edge off, and then maybe burn it again, wire brush it, and by the end of it, you'll feel that it's got a really nice feel to it, really a real natural feel to it, as opposed to being something which is completely harsh. All right, it's time for a bit of a coffee break, and then I'm going to start talking about directional movement with the carving tools, which is probably the most important part of the podcast. If you've ever, and I mean this to everybody that's listening, if you've ever used an electric carving tool, you've had it jump, no matter who you are. It happens to me, still happens to me. I've been carving for, I don't know how long time. It still happens to me. It happens to all of us. So don't beat yourself up. If it does happen, just change your design slightly, reincorporate things. It happens. But there's a couple of little tips and tricks that I have in my mind that when I was thinking about carving and while I was doing it, it's like, okay, so I've got control of this tool. How do I verbalize to all these bonsai lovers that possibly while you're doing this podcast, dragging out their Dremel, dusting it off and getting out all the bits that they've got, thinking, yep, I've got that tree I've been thinking about carving. How do I put into words without pictures how you are controlling this tool? And I think I've got it. So hear me out. This is going to sound a bit, you might need to listen to this part a couple of times. I might even need to say it a couple of times to get it right, but I'll do my best. All right, so righto, you've got the Dremel. It's facing away from you. You're holding it with both hands, left and right hand, and you're holding it away from you. The tip should be spinning in a clockwise direction. Okay? If it's spinning whatever you've got spinning in an anti-clockwise direction, reverse exactly what I'm going to say. But let's assume the tip is spinning, and I'm spinning my finger. I wish I should video this one. I'm spinning my finger around as I'm talking so I can get my words right. So it's spinning in a clockwise direction. Okay. So when you're working with that tool, if you push it to the left-hand side, so let's say the tree, your bonsai, the carving part that you want to do, is on the left-hand side of where you're working, then the cutting part is coming from underneath and working up. Okay, so it's going around, it's coming down towards the 6 hand on the clock, and it's going up towards the 9, and then completing the circle around. Right. So what you want to do is, if this is where you can get complete control of the tool that you're using, whether it's a die grinder. If it's a die grinder, I find I hold it a hell of a lot tighter. But let's work with a Dremel. It's on about the 70% of its speed mark. It's spinning in a clockwise direction, the tip of the blade. Now what you want to do is push and work up. So you want that cutting tool to be working from the lower point, working up the tree. If you start at the top part and work your way down, your cutting tool isn't working as it's meant to be, right? It'll jump. It'll feel like it's slipping down quite rapidly. Whereas when you push it to the left at the lowest point and work your way up, that cutting tool constantly is holding you in place because it's hitting the wood on its way up and will pressure against your hands. So if you work from the top, this is pushing to the left-hand side. If you work from the top down, as you're going down, you're going to find that there's next to no resistance on that cutting blade, and you'll find that the tool will very quickly jump down. All right. So now let's keep that thought process going. So it's spinning in a clockwise direction. You put the tree on the right-hand side because sometimes you can't always work from the bottom. Sometimes you want to work from the top of the tree up. What I'd suggest is put the tree onto the right-hand side and work from the top down. So that way that cutting blade, again, is pushing against the wood of the tree as you're moving it down. If the tree's on the right-hand side and you start at the bottom and work your way up, you're going to find it's going to want to jump because there's no resistance against that cutting blade. All right, so hopefully that helps. Try and avoid, if you look at the cutting tool that you've got on whatever it is that you're working with, you'll find that unless it's a conical burr bit, which is the cone, you'll find that the cutting is going to be done on the left or right side of that blade. They're not designed to be used straight on with the tree. So if you're pushing straight on, you're pushing the flat part of the cutting tool against the wood, it's going to jump all over the place. It's going to hit those fibers when it does start to cut, and it's going to swing around in a circle in that clockwise motion. And it's very, very hard to control. By putting the tree onto the left-hand side, you'll get the cutting bit hitting the tree on its side, which is exactly how it should be, and working from the bottom and working against the spinning direction of the tree. All right. So if you need to cut from the top down, or if you want to work it from that right side because that's maybe your stronger side, then if it's spinning in the clockwise direction, start at the top of the tree and work your way down. As I said at the very start of the podcast, this needs practice. This part especially is something that you're going to have to get the feel of, because it's saying it to it's confusing. I feel it's confusing as I say it, but look at the direction it's spinning and work with the blade hitting and constantly being in contact. So as the revolutions go, it's working against the direction that you're moving. So if it's cutting and it's going in an upward direction, then work up. If it's cutting and going in a downward direction, then work in a downward fashion. That way that blade is going to hit resistance and it's going to be far easier to control. If it's spinning that way and you're working in an opposite direction, it's cutting up and you're working down, I guarantee you'll find that it will jump. And the harder you press, the more it's going to jump. So you've got to have really firm control of this cutting device, like both hands. Best way to stop you losing a digit is to have both hands on the tool anyway. And when it jumps, for God's sake, resist the urge to take a hand off and grab it. That's when things can go wrong. If it does jump for whatever reason, just let it do its thing. Then stop, have a look at, review your practices, and I guarantee you, if it's going to, not guarantee you, but for me, my experience is the tighter I get, the less I think about this resistance cutting as I'm moving the machine. I'll start cutting on the right hand side from the bottom, trying to work up, and then all of a sudden it jumps and I'm off. It's it's like, oh God, that just tore absolute shreds out of it. And the bigger the cutting head that you've got, the absolute more damage you're going to do. So I try and minimize the size of the cutting head. There's some beasts out there that are massive, that are designed to go through tree trunks that are a meter across. They'll tear them to shreds in no time at all. I've got them in my collection. Do I use them? No chance. They do far too much damage. And I used to love them because you get them on and go, in less than 30 seconds, I've done the carving that I want. But when I go back and look at those trees, it's no finesse in the cutting. There's no interest. It's just a hollow. It's just something which has been torn to shreds. Whereas I find with the smaller bits, it might take me a little bit longer, but I've got far more control and I can put far more texture and interest into those cuts. And I tend to look back on that carving a lot more favourably than the stuff that I've just torn shreds out of, because you can tear shreds out of it. It's sort of becomes pointless. You want interest. You want the carving to be the absolute champion of whatever it is that you're working with. You don't want to look at it and go, man, it's just you've taken off 3/4 of the wood off that tree. It's something that's got to really draw you in. So smaller bits will be far better. Anyway, so the directional carving that I was talking about, that pressure that you can apply, it all comes down to control, which is the most important part of anything that we do with bonsai. You're working with a living object. Carving is one of those things that we can use, that we do use, that, dare I say it, we probably should use. It creates great interest. Does it need to be 3/4 of the tree on the bottom of the workshop floor after you're finished? No, it doesn't. Can it be really subtle and maybe small little pieces of the puzzle of your bonsai? Sure can. Is it something you should use on every tree? Maybe not every tree, but here and there, definitely. You got a dead branch on the tree. Would it benefit by being maybe hollowed out a little bit? Would it be more interesting rather than just being a stick? Sure, it can just be a dead branch. 100% it can. But carving is one of those things that I think once and we all love it. Like I said, it seems to be seems to be a bloody rite of passage to have bonsai to buy carving tools around the place. Everyone's got them. Everyone's got carving tools. I love them. I really do. But they've got to be used, I'll recap it. Got to be used safely. You've got to have complete control, and it's got to be bloody interesting. It's got to be something that's going to draw you in, and not just be carving for the sake of carving. That's ridiculous. That's just completely pointless. So if you're going to do it, have justification in your head. Have a clear path. Now, when we style our trees, when we wire and shape, or whenever we do anything with our trees, we're doing it with intent to achieve something. We have a plan. We have a process. It can take years. It doesn't need to be overnight. Carving's exactly the same thing. It might be that you grow a tree to a certain point for 3 years and then look at the carving process. Doing it now while the tree is younger, is it going to hinder, or is it going to add to the design? You've got to practice it. It is like any skill. It's like wiring. You don't just start slapping wire on a tree because you're going to do damage. You build your skill set up. Using these tools, these very dangerous tools, is exactly the same. And I don't care what bit you've got on there. I'll tell you another thing too that just popped into my head. Wire brush. You can get little wire brush attachments for your Dremels. They work great. They help with that smoothing process, that last piece of the puzzle that I talked about. Maybe instead of using a wire brush, you think, I've got this wire bit that I can put in the Dremel that'll do it. Yep, sure, done. Perfect. They work great. But there's some really crap quality ones, and those little shards of steel that are in the end can flick out, and they can do some serious damage embedding into your eyes, your face, your arm, your body, whatever. So I've completely moved away from using them. I bought a heap on online platforms that came from maybe not the best manufacturing sources. I've even bought good ones at reputable suppliers, and they all seem to do the same thing. The wire does not seem to hold. It doesn't seem to last. It seems to whittle off pretty quickly. I don't think they're designed for bonsai. I think maybe they've got another application of removing paint off metal objects in tight spaces. So just if you're going to use them, just be very careful. Protect yourself, because once your eyesight's stuffed, then you really don't have much choice. But you've got to have complete control of the tools. So that working with the spinning, thinking about how the head is going to spin on the tool, practicing working against the grain, but also try it where you're working against the spinning, so it's going in the opposite direction to where you want. So spinning to the left, work from the bottom up. Spinning to the right, work from the top down. Try in the opposite direction as well, and get a feel for it, and get a feel for what it's like to lose complete control when that thing jumps and be at the mercy of the gods. If you're working in tight spaces with lots of branches and you get that carving tool to jump, you're going to be having branches sit on the ground. They're not going to be stuck on the tree anymore, and possibly even worse. So just completely get control of this tool before you start using it. Have a plan, have a vision. Don't just start carving and think, geez, I wonder where this thing is going to finish up, because you'll end up with a lot of wood chips on the ground where not much bonsai left, and you'll be disappointed. So have a plan, build up the database in your head about what good carving looks like. You'll never be able to completely replicate things, but there is absolutely nothing wrong with having that vision or an image that you work towards with your carving, to think this tree would look really good if it had this bit of carving, and I've seen that here. I think that would work really, really well. And the type of carving that you do too, it's greatly influenced by the strength of the deadwood, of the heartwood, of the fibers of the tree that you're dealing with. Some trees are designed to rot, like maples. They just do not hold their fiber. Junipers are great; they will hold that wood together forever. Pine trees, you might get sort of 6-7 years out of them, but then sooner or later it's going to go. So just be careful when you're choosing the type of deadwood that you're working with. But really, this was, I suppose, I wanted this podcast to be more about the how-tos and some other facts when it comes to following the grain of the wood, and making sure that you build texture into it, removing the feel of man-made carving by using fire and smoothing things off and making it more natural, and also get it in your head that it doesn't need to be done in one sitting. This is something, it's a static part of the art that we work with. When we're working with trees, it's dynamic, it's changing day in, day out, and year on year it changes. Carving doesn't. Carving's like pottery. Once it's done, that's it. The piece is finished. Once it's fired, it's set, bang, that's it. Carving's very similar to that. So I find the end point might be something that I work towards, that I just do little bits of finesse, and I find that I have complete control and my mind's in the right space and I'm fresh and I'm ready to go. And it's exciting. I love carving. I really do. I hope you love carving. Everyone that I seem to talk to loves, carving comes up when you talk about bonsai. But just be careful, build your skill set up and make sure that it's something that you practice and do it right, because you've really got one chance to knock this thing on the head. Who would have thought you could yabber on a podcast about carving for so long? But it is one of these things that I think every bonsai practitioner, artist, enthusiast, caretaker, whatever it is, sooner or later, carving is going to come across your radar, and it might be something you're not comfortable with. It's definitely not something that you'll find that there's schools for, or not many anyway, that will do it, because it is bloody dangerous and there's a lot of onus on the user to make sure that they get it right. So you can be sort of swimming in the dark a little bit when you are learning to carve. And it is one of these things that comes often through experience and often through learning things the bloody hard way, because there's, like I said, there's no one there to tell you how to do these things or why they do them. And sure, there's some online resources. There's lots of examples you'll see online of it, but it's probably never broken down as much as what it should be. So hopefully there's a few little tips in there that will help you, won't stop things from happening. And like I said, I carve a bit, and these things still happen day in, day out. So don't feel bad about it. Just rework the design. Try and do things in small snippets. Take the wins as they come. Don't try and overwork yourself or the tree. And watch the tools don't overheat as well, because you find that often when you're holding them, you'll be covering up those air vents where they do cool themselves down. Wear things like gloves, safety goggles. I'm nervous putting this out into the podcast world, because I don't want to be seen to be condoning using dangerous tools. But please be really, really careful. I'd hate to hear that anyone's hurt himself as a result of using carving tools for the first time. Speed's really important. Too fast is dangerous. Too slow is even more dangerous, I'd reckon. So there's that sweet spot, and practice. Just work on something that's not gonna bring tears to your eyes, and just make sure that you get the technique right, and just little bit by little bit. But anyway, all right. So I want to wrap up the podcast now. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you to everyone who subscribes to the podcast. You're bloody godsends, and I love you all. But I want to finish off by saying what's good for bonsai is good for all of us. There's a lot of there can be a lot of negativity around in the world. Let it go. Don't be part of it. Yeah, whatever improves bonsai wherever you are in your little part of the world, improves bonsai for absolutely every single person around the world. So I would strongly, enthusiastically, wholeheartedly encourage you to put a positive spin on anything. The online world sometimes can be a harsh place. It can bring tears, to people's eyes, and maybe the comments that are made, maybe they're intended to hurt people, maybe they're not. I don't know, but all I do is just encourage everybody that if you're a bonsai lover, then just love bonsai and love the people that are associated with bonsai. We all do our very best, and it's such a beautiful world that we live in. I love this bonsai bubble that I have. I love the people that I meet. I love the enthusiasm, and I just if you can spread it on and share the bonsai love with your fellow bonsai lover, then I think the world's going to be a better place. Anyway, take care. Weather's absolutely nuts at the moment for me. Yeah, we're going from nearly 40 degrees one day to a couple of days later we're down to 17 degrees. There's talk about summer snow sessions happening in low-lying areas. It's just berserk at the moment. So please keep an eye on your trees. Watch the watering. There's no hard and fast rules as to what to do. But if you are in those regions where it is getting absolutely cooked at the moment, right at this last part of the calendar period for summer, then think about a cooling environment, and that can come from misting your trees, trying to cool those pots down. I had someone tell me that they'd measured the temperature on pots the other day, and it was nearly 70 degrees Celsius, and that's definitely not good for the root system of your trees. So think about the environment that you've got your trees in and how you can possibly cool it down, and what strategies you can use. Shade cloth, maybe wet towels over the pots during the hottest part of the day. I have seen and heard people using aluminium foil around the pots to try and deflect heat as well. I use misting systems. Don't worry about burning the foliage; it just won't happen. It's a wives' tale. But just look at how you can cool the environment down. Not necessarily get water into the tree system. Just look at how you can cool it down, and you'll be right. We're almost at the end of summer, so bring on the cooler months. It's going to be nice. So anyway, thanks for listening in. Love you all, and until next time, happy bonsai.